We propose a new institution, the Tellian Empress announced. The Academy of the Ancient Resonance to be established on Earth. Its purpose, to teach all species how to truly partner with the creatures of our galaxy. The motion passed unanimously. 6 months later, Thomas stood in a field in Nebraska, watching the construction of the Academy. It was a beautiful building, designed to house students from every species, surrounded by habitats for creatures from across the galaxy. Marcus Webb had become the head groundskeeper. Emily was the chief animal welfare officer. Even General Kane had requested a position as a combat instructor, teaching others how to fight alongside creatures rather than with them. The ancient dragons had stayed, taking roles as teachers and guardians. They seemed content, their long search finally over. A ship landed nearby. From it emerged a group of young students, humans, Kroviks, Tellians, and a dozen other species. They were the Academy's first class. A small human girl, maybe 7 years old, approached Thomas shyly. "Are you the one who tamed the dragons?" Thomas knelt down to her level. Behind him, he felt Solarius's amused presence. "I never tamed anything," he said gently. "I just learned to listen. And that's what we're going to teach you." The girl's eyes widened with wonder. That evening, Thomas returned to the stables, now a vast facility where creatures from across the galaxy were cared for with respect and love. He ran his hand along the stall of a thornback, the same species he'd fed on his first day at the Convergence. "We did it," he whispered to the beast. "We actually did it." The thornback rumbled contentedly, and Thomas felt its simple satisfaction through their bond. His mother found him there an hour later. Helen Reed had aged well, though her hair had gone completely gray during the crisis. "Dinner's ready," she said. "And you have about 40 dignitaries waiting to speak with you." Thomas groaned. "Can't I just go back to being a stable boy?" Helen laughed. "You're still a stable boy, Tommy. Just one with a much bigger stable." As they walked back to the Academy, Thomas looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Void Swarm was healing a broken world. The Leviathans sang their ancient songs. Creatures across the galaxy lived in partnership with species who had once seen them as tools or resources. The ancient dragons had been right. The galaxy had needed a Beastmaster Prime. But more than that, it had needed to remember a simple truth, that every living being, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, had value, had worth, had a voice if someone would just listen. Thomas Reed, former stable boy from Earth, had listened. And in doing so, he changed everything. The end. Thomas sat in a chair that was too large for him, in a room filled with beings who could barely hide their shock and anger. The diplomatic chamber was circular, with walls made of some translucent material that shifted colors. Around the table sat representatives from a dozen different species, all staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. Ambassador James Thorne, the human representative, paced back and forth like a caged animal. His face was pale and sweaty. Every few seconds he would glance at Thomas, then at the door, then back at Thomas again. Outside that door, the 3 ancient dragons waited. They were too massive to fit inside any building, so they had settled in the plaza like mountains that had suddenly decided to take a rest. "Can someone please explain what's happening?" Thomas asked. It was the 5th time he had asked this question in the past hour, and he still hadn't received an answer that made any sense. The air shimmered, and suddenly a holographic image of Boreas appeared above the table. The blue dragon's eyes were kind, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle, nothing like the overwhelming presence Thomas had felt in the plaza. "You possess something we call the ancient resonance," Boreas explained. "It is a frequency of consciousness, a way of thinking and feeling that appears only once every few thousand years. Those who have it can understand all living beings at their deepest level. Not just what they do but why they do it. What they feel. What they need. You are what we call a Beastmaster Prime." Thomas shook his head. "I'm just a stable boy. I feed animals and clean their pens. That's all." The golden dragon Solarius materialized beside Boreas. Her voice was warmer, like sunlight. "You are much more than that, Thomas Reed. We have been searching for someone like you for centuries. The galaxy needs you now more than ever." Before Thomas could respond, General Victor Kane slammed his massive fist down on the table. The reptilian warrior stood nearly 7 feet tall, covered in dark green scales that reflected the room's changing lights. His yellow eyes blazed with fury. "The Krovik Empire will not accept this insult." Kane's voice was a harsh hiss. "A human child, barely more than an infant by our standards, receiving honor above our greatest warriors? Above our scholars? Above our leaders? This is impossible. It is offensive." Other voices joined his. An insectoid representative clicked angrily. A floating being made of crystalline structures chimed in sharp, discordant tones. The room erupted into argument. Noctis, the dark dragon, appeared as a shadow among the holograms. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. Then test him. The room fell silent. Test him? Kane repeated. If you doubt his ability, then put him to the test, Noctis said calmly. Let him prove himself worthy or let him fail. Either way, you will have your answer. And so it was decided. Thomas would undergo something called the Trial of Worth. He would have to journey to a place called the Serpent's Maw, a dangerous region of space that few ships ever entered. There, he would need to make peaceful contact with the Leviathans, massive creatures that lived in the void of space itself. No one had successfully communicated with the Leviathans in thousands of years. As the meeting broke up, Ambassador Thorne pulled Thomas aside. The older man's hands were shaking. You don't have to do this, he whispered urgently. Refuse the test. We'll protect you. We'll get you back to Earth safely. Thomas looked at the ambassador's frightened face. Then he thought about the creatures he had cared for in the stables. The thornback that everyone else feared but that had always been gentle with him. The small flying creatures from the Andari system that would land on his shoulder and chirp softly. The massive herbivore from Tellus Prime that had been sick and dying until Thomas had somehow known exactly what it needed. They had always understood him. And he had always understood them. Maybe the dragons were right. Maybe there was something different about him. I'll do it, Thomas said quietly. The crew for his journey was assembled within hours. Daniel Cross was a warrior from the Draxan fleets, a species known for their military prowess. He was tall and muscular, with gray skin and eyes that missed nothing. He made it clear from the start that he thought this entire mission was ridiculous and that Thomas was going to get them all killed. Rachel Moore was a human engineer, one of the best in the fleet. She was in her 30s, with red hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that were always moving, always adjusting something or checking a readout. She seemed excited by the challenge, though Thomas could see worry in her eyes when she looked at him. And Solarius herself would accompany them as their guide. A being of pure energy and ancient wisdom, traveling alongside a stable boy and his small crew. Their ship was small but fast, designed for long-range exploration. As it pulled away from the convergence, Thomas stood at the viewport and watched the massive station grow smaller. He could see Emily's face in his mind. She had hugged him so tightly before he left, crying and making him promise to come back. Marcus had gripped his shoulder hard and said only, "Come back alive, kid." The journey took 3 days. During that time, strange things began to happen. On the second day, Daniel was running Thomas through combat training. The warrior was frustrated because Thomas was clumsy and slow. Daniel's anger built and built until he finally shouted and threw his practice weapon across the room. And Thomas felt it. Not just saw it or heard it. He felt Daniel's anger like a physical wave washing over him. It was hot and sharp and painful. Without thinking, without knowing how, Thomas reached out with something inside himself and gently pushed back. The anger cooled. Daniel blinked, confused, his rage suddenly gone. "What did you just do?" Daniel asked, his voice uncertain. Thomas had no answer. Later, as they passed through a nebula, they encountered a school of cosmic fish, strange creatures that lived in space itself, feeding on radiation and stellar dust. There were thousands of them, swimming through the void like birds in flight. Thomas felt their presence. He felt their simple joy at existing, at moving, at being alive. It was pure and uncomplicated and beautiful. "The gift is awakening," Solarius observed, watching Thomas's face. "You are beginning to understand what you truly are." On the 4th day they reached the Serpent's Maw. Thomas had never seen anything like it. Space itself seemed twisted and wrong. Gravity pulled in directions that shouldn't exist. Light moved in spirals and curves instead of straight lines. Colors that had no names flickered at the edges of his vision. "The Leviathans live here because no one else can," Rachel explained, her instruments going wild. "The laws of physics barely apply. Most ships that enter never come back." They didn't have to wait long. The first Leviathan appeared like a mountain rising from an ocean. It was larger than their entire ship, larger than most buildings Thomas had ever seen. Its body was covered in what looked like armor plating, but it moved with impossible grace through the twisted space. Thomas closed his eyes. He reached out with that part of himself that was just beginning to wake up. He reached out with the ancient resonance. And he felt something that made his heart break. The Leviathan was lonely. So deeply, profoundly lonely that it was like a physical ache. It had been alone for so long that loneliness had become its entire existence. "Hello," Thomas whispered. He didn't speak with words but with feelings and understanding. I see you. I understand. You're not alone anymore. The Leviathan sang. The sound shook their ship, made the instruments scream warnings, rattled Thomas's teeth in his skull. But he understood it. He understood what it meant. Tears streamed down Thomas's face as the Leviathan's memories flooded into his mind. Ancient memories, passed down through generations of these massive creatures. They remember, Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion. They remember the last Beastmaster Prime. Her name was Sarah. She lived 10,000 years ago. She united all the creatures of the galaxy, everything from the smallest microbes to the largest beasts. She united them all against something terrible. Against what? Rachel asked. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at his crew. Against the Void Swarm. A hive mind of cosmic parasites that corrupts all biological life it touches. It consumes everything. Solarius's golden light dimmed with sorrow. And it is returning. That is why we search for you, Thomas Reed. That is why the galaxy needs a Beastmaster Prime once more. Thomas had passed his trial. The Leviathans had accepted him. But as their ship turned back toward the convergence, he understood that this had only been the beginning. The real test, the real battle, was still ahead. Retrike. Thomas stood in the council chamber once more, but everything had changed. He was no longer the frightened stable boy who had been dragged before the ancient dragons. The Leviathans had shared their memories with him, and those memories weighed heavy on his mind. He had seen things that happened 10,000 years ago as clearly as if they had happened yesterday. He knew the truth now and it terrified him. The Void Swarm was coming. Ambassador Thorne stood at the front of the room, presenting holographic images to the assembled representatives. The projections showed something that made even the bravest warriors in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. Black tendrils writhed across the screens, consuming everything they touched. Ships disappeared into the darkness. Entire planets went silent. These are the Swarm Scouts, Thorne explained, his voice tight with stress. We've lost contact with 17 frontier colonies in the past week. The pattern is always the same. First, communications go dark. Then, when we send ships to investigate, we find this. The hologram shifted to show the wreckage of a colony. Buildings still stood, but they were covered in a black substance that seemed to pulse with unnatural life. Bodies lay in the streets, but they weren't dead. They were moving, twitching, their eyes empty of anything human or alien. They had become extensions of the swarm itself. Rachel Moore stood and added her analysis. Data scrolled across multiple screens, showing battle reports and scientific readings. Conventional weapons don't work, she said bluntly. The swarm learns and adapts within minutes. Laser fire, missiles, even nuclear weapons. It absorbs them all and becomes stronger. And it doesn't just destroy biological life. It corrupts it. It turns every living thing into part of itself. General Kane rose from his seat, his scales bristling with aggression. Then the solution is simple. We burn the infected worlds. Sterilize entire star systems if we must. Destroy everything before the swarm can spread. Ambassador Thorne's face went pale. That's genocide. You're talking about killing billions of innocent people. I'm talking about survival, Kane hissed back. Better to sacrifice a few systems than lose the entire galaxy. The council erupted into argument. Species that barely tolerated each other began shouting across the table. Some agreed with Kane's brutal logic. Others were horrified by the suggestion. The noise grew louder and more chaotic with each passing second. Thomas stood up. He didn't shout or raise his voice. He simply stood and somehow the room gradually fell silent. All eyes turned to him. There's another way, Thomas said quietly. The last Beastmaster Prime didn't fight the swarm with weapons. She united every living creature in the galaxy, everything from the smallest organisms to the largest beasts. She created a network of consciousness that the swarm couldn't corrupt because it was built on understanding and cooperation, not on domination and control. The Tellian Empress stared at him as if he had suggested they all jump into a star. You're suggesting we trust our fate to animals? To creatures without intelligence or technology? I'm suggesting we partner with them, Thomas replied. Every species in this galaxy evolved alongside other creatures. You all had animals on your homeworlds. You all have creatures that you use for transportation, for labor, for companionship. We've just forgotten that they're more than tools. We've forgotten how to really listen to them. The air shimmered as the three ancient dragons manifested in holographic form. Boreas spoke, his voice grave. The boy speaks the truth. This is the only way to defeat the swarm. But time is running out. Our sensors show that the swarm's main force has begun moving. It will reach populated space within weeks. Thomas didn't waste any time. With Solarius guiding him, he began reaching out to every creature housed in the Convergence's xenobiology sector. He closed his eyes and extended his consciousness like invisible threads, touching each mind he encountered. The sensation was overwhelming. He felt the simple contentment of a herbivore from Tellus Prime as it ate. He felt the restless energy of a pack of hunting beasts from the Draxan worlds. He felt the confusion of a bird-like creature from the Andari system, trapped far from its home skies. Hundreds of minds, each one unique, each one alive in its own way, each one capable of understanding if someone would just take the time to communicate properly. Emily and Marcus threw themselves into helping him. They worked with other humans on the station, teaching them what Thomas had always known instinctively, that creatures weren't stupid or simple. They were different, with their own ways of thinking and communicating. You just had to learn their language. Word of what Thomas was doing spread through the station. Slowly, reluctantly, representatives from other species began to approach. They wanted to learn. They wanted to understand how this human stable boy could do what he did. But not everyone was convinced. The Kravic Empire, proud of their military might and their warrior traditions, refused to participate. General Kane spoke for his people before the council. The Kravic do not grovel before animals, he declared. We will face the swarm with our fleet, with our weapons, with our courage. We need no help from beasts or from stable boys. Kane led his fleet out to meet the swarm's advanced scouts at the edge of Kravic territory. Thomas begged him not to go, warned him that weapons wouldn't work, but Kane wouldn't listen. Pride and tradition were more important than the warnings of a human child. Thomas watched the battle through the communication feeds and his heart broke. The Kravic warships were magnificent, sleek and powerful, armed with the most advanced weapons in the galaxy. They should have been unstoppable. But the swarm didn't care about advanced weapons. The black tendrils wrapped around the ships, eating through their hulls like acid through paper. When the Kravics fired their weapons, the swarm absorbed the energy and grew stronger. When they tried to retreat, the swarm was faster. Within 3 hours, half of the Kravic fleet was gone. The ships that remained were damaged and fleeing. Worse than the destroyed vessels were the ones that the swarm had captured intact. Through the view screens, Thomas could see Kravic warriors stumbling across their own decks, their eyes empty, their bodies controlled by the swarm's will. General Kane's face appeared on the main screen. The proud warrior looked broken. His scales were dull with shock. His voice was barely a whisper. "Help us," Kane said. "Please. I was wrong. We were all wrong." Thomas didn't hesitate. He reached out across the vast distance of space with his gift. The Kravics used battle beasts in their military, massive armored creatures bred for war over thousands of years. Thomas found their minds and felt their pain and confusion. They had been sent to die, forced to fight in ways that made no sense to them. He showed them something different. Not commands or orders, but understanding. Partnership. He showed them that their Kravic handlers could be allies instead of masters. The battle beasts responded. They turned the tide of the fight, not through rebellion but through true cooperation. Working together with their handlers as equals, they developed tactics that the swarm couldn't predict. The creatures were faster and more adaptable than machines, and they fought with intelligence and purpose. What remained of the Kravic fleet was saved. When Kane returned to the Convergence, he walked directly to Thomas and knelt, lowering his head the same way the ancient dragons had. Around him, his warriors did the same. "I understand now," Kane said, his voice thick with emotion. "Forgive my arrogance. Forgive my pride. I cost my people so many lives because I refused to listen." Thomas helped Kane to his feet. "There's no time for apologies or regrets. We have work to do and I need your help." Earth became the center of everything. Thomas's childhood home, a small farm in Nebraska with fields of corn and a red barn, became the training ground where representatives from across the galaxy came to learn. His mother, Helen Reed, found herself cooking meals for alien dignitaries and housing warriors from species she had never heard of before. She laughed about it, amazed at how her quiet son had somehow changed the course of galactic history. But Thomas felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. Every day brought news of more worlds falling to the swarm. Every night, he dreamed of billions of voices crying out in terror before going silent. The responsibility was crushing him. One evening, he sat alone in the barn where he had worked as a child, his head in his hands. Solarius appeared beside him, her golden light soft and warm. "I can't do this," Thomas whispered. "I'm just a stable boy. I don't know how to save the galaxy." "You were chosen precisely because you are humble," Solarius said gently. "Power corrupts those who seek it. But you never wanted any of this. You never asked for glory or recognition. That's exactly why you're worthy of this responsibility. Before Thomas could respond, alarms began blaring across the station. Rachel's voice came over the emergency system, tight with fear. The swarm's main force has arrived at the edge of known space. It's bigger than we thought. Much bigger. Thomas ran to the observation deck and looked out at the sensor readings being displayed. The swarm appeared as a massive cloud of darkness, so large that it eclipsed entire stars. It was moving toward them and nothing in its path would survive. The final battle was coming and Thomas knew that everything, the entire future of all life in the galaxy, depended on what happened next. The void swarm arrived like a nightmare made real. Thomas stood on the command deck of the Convergence, staring out at the viewport, and felt his breath catch in his throat. The darkness stretched across 3 entire star systems, blotting out the light of distant suns. It was a living thing, billions upon billions of parasitic organisms moving together as one massive, terrible consciousness. Every tendril, every writhing piece of that black mass, was connected to a single hungry mind. Around Thomas, the command deck was filled with representatives from every major species in the galaxy. The Tellian Empress stood next to General Kane. Ambassador Thorne paced nervously near the tactical displays. Daniel cross-checked his weapons for the 10th time, though they all knew conventional arms would be useless. Outside, the largest military fleet ever assembled floated in formation, but every person in that room understood that weapons alone would not save them. Rachel Moore worked frantically at her station, her fingers dancing across holographic controls. "The network is ready," she announced, her voice tight with tension. "Every creature on this station, every beast on our ships, every animal on the nearby colonies, they're all connected through you, Thomas. Millions of them." Thomas closed his eyes and felt the network come alive in his mind. It was like suddenly becoming aware of every nerve in an impossibly vast body. He felt the ancient leviathans positioning themselves between the station and the approaching darkness, their massive forms moving through space like mountains floating in an ocean. He felt the smaller creatures aboard the ships, nervous and confused but trusting. He felt the microbes that lived in the station's water systems, the flying creatures in the biodomes, the battle beasts standing ready with their handlers. Millions of minds, each one unique, each one connected to him through the ancient resonance. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was almost too much to bear. "They're coming," Daniel announced from the tactical station. 3 minutes until they reach engagement range. Ambassador Thorne walked over and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. The man's palm was sweaty, trembling slightly. "No pressure, son," he said with a weak attempt at humor, "but you're literally our only hope right now." Thomas managed a grim smile despite the fear churning in his stomach. "Thanks. That really helps." The swarm struck first. Without warning, without hesitation, massive tendrils of corrupted biomass shot forward at speeds that should have been impossible. They reached across the void like the arms of some cosmic monster, grasping for the fleet. Thomas took a deep breath. "Now," he whispered. The leviathans moved in perfect coordination, as if they were all parts of the same organism. Their massive bodies shifted into position, forming living shields between the tendrils and the fleet. When the swarm's attack struck their ancient hides, something remarkable happened. The tendrils stopped. They didn't bounce off or get destroyed, they simply stopped, their energy absorbed and transformed into something harmless. The leviathans weren't fighting. They were understanding. They were accepting the swarm's aggression and giving back peace in return. But there were too many tendrils. Too many vectors of attack coming from too many directions. The leviathans couldn't shield everything. "Phase 2, Thomas commanded, his voice strained with concentration. From the fleet, from the station, from every ship and colony in range, swarms of smaller creatures emerged. Millions of them poured into space, each one no larger than a human fist. The military advisors had dismissed these creatures as insignificant, too small and weak to matter in a battle of this scale. But Thomas knew better. Working in perfect synchronization through his consciousness, the small creatures targeted the swarm's neural clusters, the points where the hive mind's control was strongest. Like surgeons with tiny scalpels, they disrupted the swarm's coordination, creating chaos in its ranks. The swarm adapted instantly. It shifted tactics, abandoning its frontal assault. Instead, it began spreading across the surface of the ships themselves, corrupting the metal hull plating and trying to work its way inside. General Kane's voice boomed across the command channel. "Battle beasts engage." The Kravik battle beasts responded immediately. These massive armored creatures had a unique biology that allowed them to generate powerful electromagnetic pulses. They crawled across the exterior of the ships, their handlers working alongside them, and everywhere they went, the corruption withered and died. The swarm's creeping darkness couldn't survive the cleansing energy. But the swarm was learning. For every tendril they destroyed, two more appeared. For every tactic they tried, the swarm found a counter. It was adapting faster than they could respond. Rachel's voice cut through the chaos, sharp with alarm. Thomas, we're losing ground. The swarm is spreading faster than we can contain it. At this rate, we have maybe an hour before it reaches the station. Thomas felt the strain of coordinating millions of minds simultaneously. It was like trying to hold together a collapsing star with nothing but his bare hands. His nose was bleeding, the blood dripping down onto his shirt. His vision blurred at the edges. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion. Solarius's voice appeared in his mind, urgent and worried. Thomas, the swarm is trying to breach your consciousness. It senses that you're the nexus, the center of the entire network. If it corrupts you, everything falls apart. I know, Thomas gasped. He could feel the swarm probing at his mind, searching for weaknesses, looking for a way to get inside his head and take control. Emily's voice suddenly crackled over the communication system. Thomas, the creatures in the stable, they want to help, but they're terrified. They don't understand what's happening. Something clicked in Thomas's mind at those words. The creatures were scared. They were confused. They were responding with fear because they didn't understand. And the swarm? The swarm was afraid too. He'd been so focused on fighting, on defending, on coordinating attacks, that he hadn't stopped to actually listen. He hadn't used his gift the way he was meant to use it. Everyone stop attacking. Thomas shouted suddenly. The command deck erupted in protest. General Kane roared in disbelief. Are you insane? They're killing us. Trust me. Thomas pleaded. Please just trust me. The fleet ceased fire. The creature swarms pulled back. The Leviathans held their positions but stopped their defensive transformations. For a brief moment, everything went still. Thomas reached out, but this time not with force or strategy. He reached out with the same gentle understanding he'd used on frightened animals in the stable back when he was just a boy. He reached out with compassion. He touched the swarm's consciousness. What he found shocked him to his core. The void swarm wasn't evil. It wasn't a monster or a villain. It was ancient beyond comprehension, vast beyond measure, and utterly, desperately alone. It consumed other life because consumption was the only way it knew how to connect. It destroyed because it had forgotten that any other form of interaction was possible. It was like a child who had been isolated for so long that it had forgotten how to play without breaking everything it touched. I see you, Thomas whispered, sending his thoughts into the darkness. I understand. You're lonely. You've been alone for so long that you forgot there was any other way to exist. The swarm's assault faltered. Its tendrils slowed, hesitating. What if I showed you something different? Thomas offered gently. Not consumption. Not domination. Partnership. Understanding. Connection without destruction. You don't have to be alone anymore. You were never meant to be alone. Through his gift, through the ancient resonance, Thomas opened the entire network to the swarm. He let it feel everything he felt. The love between Emily and the creatures she cared for. The respect and trust between General Kane and his battle beasts. The ancient, deep friendship between the Leviathans and the cosmos itself. The simple joy of existing alongside others without needing to consume them. The swarm recoiled at first, overwhelmed by sensations it had never experienced. Then, slowly, carefully, like a hand reaching out in the dark, it reached back. Thomas felt the swarm's consciousness touch his own, and for one eternal moment, he experienced what it had experienced. Eons of darkness. Endless hunger that could never be satisfied. Desperate, aching loneliness that had become its entire existence. You can be more than this, Thomas told it, tears streaming down his face. I'll show you how. We all will. The black tide began to recede. Not in defeat but in acceptance. Not in surrender but in hope. The transformation took 3 days, and they were the longest 3 days of Thomas Reed's life. He remained in constant communion with the void swarm, his consciousness stretched across vast distances of space, gently teaching this ancient and lonely entity a completely new way to exist. It was exhausting work beyond anything he had ever imagined. It was like trying to teach a hurricane how to become a gentle breeze, or convincing an ocean to move one drop at a time. The swarm had spent eons knowing only consumption and hunger. Changing that fundamental nature required patience, understanding, and a strength that Thomas wasn't sure he possessed. But he wasn't alone. The creatures of the galaxy helped him. The Leviathans, ancient beyond measure, shared their wisdom about existence and purpose. The Kravik battle beasts demonstrated what it meant to have strength but use it with restraint and care. Even the smallest microbes in the station's water system showed the swarm something important: that it was possible to exist, to thrive, without consuming and destroying everything around you. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, he found himself lying in a bed in the medical bay. The lights were dim and soft. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was or how he had gotten there. His entire body ached as if he had run a marathon while carrying a mountain on his back. Emily sat in a chair beside his bed, holding his hand. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. When she saw him wake up, tears began streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. "You've been asleep for 18 hours, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "We thought we'd lost you. Your vital signs kept dropping, and the doctors couldn't do anything because you were still connected to the swarm. We didn't know if you'd ever wake up." Thomas's throat was dry and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "The swarm? What happened to it?" Emily smiled through her tears. "See for yourself." She helped him stand, supporting him as his legs wobbled beneath him. They walked slowly to the viewport, and Thomas looked out at the space beyond the station. Where the massive black tide had threatened to consume everything, where billions of parasitic tendrils had reached out to corrupt and destroy, Thomas now saw something that took his breath away. The swarm was still there, but it had changed completely. Its tendrils no longer grasped and corrupted. Instead, they moved with gentle purpose across the surface of a dead moon that had been poisoned by industrial waste centuries ago. The swarm was breaking down the toxic materials, transforming death and pollution into clean, fertile soil. Rachel Moore appeared beside them, her tablet displaying streams of data. Her face showed exhaustion but also wonder. "It's incredible, Thomas. The swarm is healing dead worlds. Polluted systems, toxic waste dumps, radiation zones, it's cleaning them all. It's become a recycler, transforming death back into the building blocks of life. It's giving back to the galaxy instead of taking from it." The door to the medical bay opened, and Ambassador Thorne entered with General Kane. Both men looked like they hadn't slept in days. Their clothes were rumpled and their faces lined with stress, but there was hope in their eyes. "The swarm has made a request," Thorne said, speaking carefully as if he still couldn't quite believe what he was saying. "It wants to form a permanent partnership with the galactic community. It wants to help us. It's asking if we'll teach it more about cooperation, about understanding, about existing alongside others instead of consuming them." Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest despite his exhaustion. "Of course we will," he said simply. "That's what this was all about." The Galactic Council convened again in the Great Chamber, but the atmosphere was completely different from their previous meetings. Species that had barely tolerated each other before, that had viewed each other with suspicion and rivalry, now worked together with genuine cooperation. The shared experience of almost losing everything, of facing extinction together, had united them in a way that no treaty or negotiation ever could. The Tellian Empress stood before the assembly, her jeweled robes catching the light. "We propose the creation of a new institution," she announced. "The Academy of the Ancient Resonance, to be established on the human homeworld of Earth. Its purpose will be to teach all species how to truly partner with the creatures of our galaxy, to foster understanding and cooperation between all forms of life." The motion passed unanimously. Not a single voice spoke against it. 6 months later, Thomas stood in a field of tall grass in Nebraska, watching construction crews from a dozen different species work together to build the academy. The building was beautiful, designed to blend architectural styles from across the galaxy. It would house students from every known species, and it was surrounded by carefully crafted habitats where creatures from hundreds of worlds could live comfortably. Marcus Webb had been appointed as the head groundskeeper. He walked the construction site with the same careful attention he had once given to the stables on the Convergence. Emily had become the chief animal welfare officer, responsible for ensuring that every creature brought to the academy was treated with respect and care. Even General Kane, the proud Kravik warrior who had once scorned the idea of partnering with animals, had requested a position as a combat instructor. He would teach others how to fight alongside creatures as true equals rather than simply using them as living weapons. The ancient dragons had chosen to stay. Boreas, Solarius, and Noctis took positions as teachers and guardians of the academy. After 10,000 years of searching for a Beastmaster Prime, their quest was finally complete, and they seemed content to pass their knowledge to future generations. A ship descended from the sky and landed in the designated area near the academy. Its doors opened and a group of young students emerged, the academy's very first class. There were humans, Kroviks, Tellians, and representatives from a dozen other species. They were children and young adults, all chosen because they had shown an aptitude for understanding and connecting with other forms of life. A small human girl, perhaps 7 years old with blonde hair and pigtails, broke away from the group and approached Thomas. She looked up at him with wide, wondering eyes. "Are you the one who tamed the dragons?" she asked in a small voice. Thomas knelt down so he was at her eye level. Behind him, he felt Solarius's presence and sensed the dragon's quiet amusement at the question. "I never tamed anything," Thomas said gently, smiling at the girl. "I just learned to listen. To really listen with more than just my ears. And that's what we're going to teach you here." The girl's eyes grew even wider with wonder and excitement. That evening, as the sun was setting and painting the Nebraska sky in shades of orange and gold, Thomas returned to the stables. They were much larger now than the simple barn he had worked in as a child. This was a vast facility where creatures from across the galaxy were housed and cared for with respect, dignity, and love. He walked along the stalls until he reached one that held a thornback, the same species of creature he had fed on his very first day working on the Galactic Convergence, back when he was just an invisible stable boy trying to make enough money to survive. Thomas ran his hand along the creature's scaled hide. "We did it," he whispered to the beast. "We actually did it. We changed everything." The thornback rumbled contentedly, a deep sound that vibrated through Thomas's bones. Through their bond, he felt the creature's simple satisfaction, its contentment at being cared for and understood. His mother found him there an hour later. Helen Reed had aged during the crisis. Her hair had gone completely gray and new lines marked her face, but she carried herself with grace and quiet strength. "Dinner's ready," she said, then added with a slight smirk, "and you have about 40 dignitaries waiting to speak with you. Something about establishing sister academies on their homeworlds." Thomas groaned and let his head fall back. "Can't I just go back to being a simple stable boy? Is that too much to ask?" Helen laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "You're still a stable boy, Tommy. Just one with a much, much bigger stable now." As they walked back toward the academy building together, Thomas looked up at the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to appear, countless points of light stretching into infinity. Somewhere out there, the void swarm was healing a broken world, giving life where there had been only death. The Leviathans sang their ancient songs as they drifted through the cosmos. Creatures across the entire galaxy now lived in true partnership with species that had once seen them as nothing more than tools, resources, or beasts of burden. The ancient dragons had been right. The galaxy had desperately needed a Beastmaster Prime to guide it through its darkest hour. But more than that, Thomas realized, the galaxy had needed to remember something simple and fundamental. Every living being, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, had value. Every creature had worth. Every life had a voice and a purpose, if only someone would take the time to listen. Thomas Reed, a former stable boy from a small farm on Earth, had listened when no one else would. And in doing so he had changed absolutely everything.